are more willing to sacrifice, to go back to our COVID conversation, which I don't want to rehash right now, but go ahead and listen to that episode. They're willing to sacrifice some personal freedoms and liberties, and I'm speaking about freedoms for people under attack. Maybe it's a bad comparison to make, so I see your point there. But after watching 2 years of news where left-leaning media outlets are saying we need to sacrifice some of our freedoms for the sake of COVID, now saying we need to defend freedoms of Ukrainians from invasion, I like seeing that.
But for the sake of what? Like, that's what I'm saying. How is there a comparison there?
In terms of...
What's the parallel, right? We're sacrificing some of our freedoms for COVID to guarantee future freedom, right?
Sure.
That was the
That's
idea.
the argument. I say it's never worth
That's my
sacrifice.
argument. That's my argument.
That's where we disagree.
Right. Yeah. I just want to circle back to the point where it feels like you're basically saying freedom is the natural domain of the right versus the left, right? Because you're excited that the left are
And you're
rallying
pushing
to it.
back
And I vehemently disagree. I think that
I appreciate your pushback here because I want more people on the left to say, no, freedom is important. We don't want government control over everything. We're worried about government overreach.
in this case, in Ukraine, the right and the left's ideal of freedom are aligned.
Mm-hmm.
And so I would just caution against you saying you're excited to see the left rally to freedom. You're excited to see the left rally to freedom in the way that you typically think of freedom.
Sure. And I think that we have other issues where maybe the left has claimed the word humanity. And you could say the right doesn't care about humanity. And now maybe someone on your side of the aisle could say, oh, it's nice seeing the right actually care about people right now. Because I've spent the past 2 years watching the right not care about people. I wanted to tug back in history a little bit. Do you think anything differently would be occurring if Trump had won re-election? If Trump was our president, would we be in the same spot we're in today?
I think Ukraine would be losing even more bigly than before.
Even more bigly. It'd be huge.
Yeah, it would be a lot more losses. Because think about it, right? The first impeachment of Trump was basically him blackmailing Ukraine. He's like, find me dirt on Hunter Biden, I'm going to withhold some things. He was much more aligned with Russian interests than President Biden is.
My pushback is that he was also more unpredictable. I think there's a famous meal he was having with President Xi of China where at the end of the meal he announced that the U.S. launched 59 cruise missiles into Syria. I don't know if Putin would be as willing to gamble, and this is a criticism and a compliment of Biden at the same time because Biden's so much more stable as a human.
I don't think that that is a fair take, in that over and over we've seen Trump sort of ask Russia for things, turn to Russia for things during his presidency, during his campaign, right? Russia hacked the emails. I think there are a lot closer ties between Trump and Putin than between Putin and Biden. And so I wonder if Trump would be less willing to act the way that we've seen Biden act.
I don't want to get into the Russian email hacking of the election. I think that Trump is not necessarily a good friend to his friends. We've seen a lot of his friends go to jail. Also, he famously had Hillary Clinton at his wedding. So when he's close to people politically or makes nice comments about North Korean dictators, which I think is a terrible thing to do, I don't know how much he personally cares about them versus he's just being friendly, overly friendly in a very unprofessional way. So maybe things would be going the same. I have my questions. I want to ask about Afghanistan here too. Did Afghanistan, do you think, play a role in what Putin's doing?
Potentially, right? And that Putin saw that maybe we're not willing to get as involved in other conflicts. And so he felt that he had impunity to go and do this. I think that's a fair take. What I would say, though, is that we unfortunately, needed to wrap up that engagement, right?
Oh, completely disagree. And a question I ask is, would Trump have pulled out of Afghanistan? Because that was his stated goal. So I think Trump and a lot of right-wingers actually agree more with your point of view than with mine here, which is a little sad for me as something of a neoconservative. It seems like a lot more people are becoming neoconservatives with these latest conflicts. Like, maybe we should play a role overseas, because if we don't, then countries might just invade other countries. Ukraine's a lot easier because there's a government that's there to handle it. It'd be like, if we help out, honestly, we don't want a hot war with Russia.
If we help out, then we might get nuked. But
I mean, we are helping out. Russia announced they're in an economic war with America right now. So what does an economic war mean? Clearly, an economic war is not enough for them to launch nuclear missiles at us.
Yeah.
But at what point does Putin become so desperate with the economic situation there that he has to take a desperate action? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, you play out where it's going, and it's definitely a potential outcome is that, Russia gets involved militarily in other ways because they've they have such a sunk cost
Mm-hmm.
in this war, and they're not going to step back. The other outcome is that they do step back, and who knows what Ukraine looks like then. They're going to have been bombarded for months on end.
Years. This could go on for a long time.
Yeah, years. And so neither outcome is great, but I think the second is still a little bit better than the first, getting involved to a hot conflict with Russia.
Point taken. I don't think anyone wants a hot war with Russia. And let's do a minor pivot here to the economic implications of what's going on, specifically in the energy sector, where America continues to use Russian oil and Europe uses a lot more of it.
When we compare the use of energy in Europe and the U.S., I think gets like 10% of its oil, roughly.
Yeah, I think it's like 8 now.
Yeah, from Russia. Whereas Europe, 40% of their gas and 45% of their oil comes from Russia. Being that it's March, you need a lot of gas for heating right now. That's a lot of power that Russia has. Fortunately, Europe is reducing emissions. To harken back to our podcast from last week about the importance of renewable energy, Europe is reducing their emissions by, I think, 55% by 2030. That's their goal. As part of that, that means they're going to be able to move away from some of the oil and gas that Russia is providing. Obviously, that does nothing in year of our Lord 2022.
And that's what I was about to say.
But I think this gets at the point of energy security.
Also, can I clarify, Matt and I are both Jewish. The year of our Lord is something like 5,700 something. But
yeah.
Common expression.
The year of others Lord.
Common
2022.
There you go. Sorry for the interruption.
Common era. This gets to the point of the importance of investing in renewable technology. I, just for fun, as I do, took a look at the EIA. It's an environmental agency. And what they do is they think about what's something called the levelized cost of energy for given fuel types. And what that means is taking into account how much it costs to build a plant, operate a plant, run it, what is the actual cost of plants. And what's amazing is solar and wind, solar in particular, and onshore wind are in the $30 to $40 a megawatt hour range. Other sources that we think about, like natural gas combined cycle, is almost at $40 per megawatt hour. So you can see that there's parity between these energy sources. And that goes to the point of we've invested in wind and energy a ton over the past decade, and costs have come way down to the point that they're competitive. And so we can continue building those, and we need to pump more money into renewable energy, and then also pump the same amount of capital into batteries so that we can then phase out gas or oil or coal power plants, because batteries will enable us to store this cheaper energy.
I'm for it. I think a criticism I've heard is that wind and solar, if it's a dark, not windy day, given we don't have batteries right now, you are dependent on a baseline fuel source. I know Germany was moving away from some of their nuclear facilities.
Yeah.
Are we in agreement on nuclear? Are you pro-nuclear?
I'm pro-nuclear.
Okay, I'm also pro-nuclear.
Yeah.
I think that's a silly decision. They're talking about putting them back online. So nuclear combined with this could lead to a zero-emission future. Like you said, a lot of this is by 2030. We're trying to hit Russia right now. Which brings us to America, unless you had a further comment there. And should we be pumping more oil here? Should we be doing more in America? This has just been a loud Republican criticism, and something that seems to unite the right side of the aisle, which is fractured in a lot of ways, that we need to get more American oil and gas. We need to be energy independent. We need to send that overseas.
The exporting of energy is a tricky issue. I agree on energy independence. I think for the most part, the U.S. does a pretty good job on that. Obviously, we should import less from Russia. We should import less from other places.
Venezuela, Iran, Saudi Arabia, not necessarily great actors.
Yes. Right now, given that we're focusing on Ukraine, going to be worried about Russia and then Europe, right? And so let's say the U.S. pumps out more energy. We have to ship that over to Europe, right, in order to do it. And so the cost of doing that is right now exceedingly high. You can liquefy the natural gas and send it across. Most of the ports where we do that are down in Louisiana. They're down in California. Sending that to Europe isn't really super great in terms of shipping path. There's one in Virginia that sends to Europe, and that's great. But so we would need to build that infrastructure, and a lot of liquefied natural gas plants are actually caught up in permitting or regulation, which I think we need to streamline our ability to get these plants online. That would be very helpful.
Are you talking about deregulating energy-related things? Matt Kaufman, what am I hearing out of you?
the energy sector is so highly regulated, but it's regulated in a way that made sense 40 years ago. Given that our grid and our pipelines are much more interstate, they go between states. You have things like federal legislation, you have something like the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission that are using antiquated laws, and people are able to challenge sort of every little thing that someone does.
Mm-hmm.
We need to rewrite those laws to make our energy regulatory system more leaner while still allowing for people to bring up these important concerns. It's just you should have to do it at the upfront and do it in a way with evidence. You can't just allege something and then it's on the company building it to go and prove that it's not happening.
There's a whole not in my backyard thing we can get into California, but I'd prefer to keep this a little more high level. A bad piece of legislation, in my opinion, is the Jones Act, which is protectionist legislation that's about 100 years old, stating that U.S. ships must be made, owned, and operated in the U.S. to deliver from one port to another. It might not be something listeners are familiar with, but it's part of the reason a lot of our energy goes overseas and why we're not energy independent, because it's really expensive to take energy made in the Gulf of Mexico and ship it, because we don't have U.S. ships. They're small ships. They have something of a monopoly power. I was just reading into this. I find it fascinating.
Yep. It's a huge issue, and that's something that we saw with natural gas as well in the U.S., like liquefied natural gas. Some of the ports that are operational in the sort of Gulf, they're not going to send their stuff up to the East Coast with regularity because the ships are so small and it becomes cost inefficient.
It makes more sense Gulf to East Coast than Gulf to West Coast, so I like it.
Well, they end up shipping to other countries for the most part.
Yep.
Right? Yeah, I was not,
I was mentioning, I think, the East Coast. You were more on point than I was there. I also want to talk about an interesting thing that happens. We keep hearing that there's a strategic release of oil from our strategic fund of oil, 60 million barrels.
It's not enough.
The U.S., I Googled it, uses 18.19 million barrels a day. That's a 2020 figure, so it's probably gone up since then. If the whole world released 60 million barrels, and that would fund the U.S. oil usage for 3 days.
Hey, 3 and change.
But this is the whole world using oil, so it probably doesn't even fund 1 day of oil usage. I just think this is sort of a silly thing that Joe Biden wants to say he's doing something, but this is not really doing much. I also don't know if we're going to need that strategic oil in terms of us actually being in a crisis. Maybe we want to hold on to that for a different time because it's not affecting prices very much.
Yeah, and let's be very clear: the 60 million barrels that are being released are being done so slowly.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like maybe you get 1 million barrels a day here, 500,000 barrels here. It's really a non-existent symbolic impact.
Well,
but I think it's important to have some kind of symbolism that Americans can help rally behind.
Yes, and I think that just because something is released in a long-term way, like a lot of oil fields, if they were to be dug up, it would take a while for the oil to actually hit the market. Prices aren't based on current estimates. They're also taking into account future oil. And so
are you saying that the market discounts back the future value of cash flows to figure out what something's worth?
Have you taken an economics course, sir?
Is that what's happening? Finance?
Welcome to the University of Chicago podcast, everybody.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
The market takes into account future prices, so maybe can have an impact there. I think an even bigger would be if we announce that we're deregulating, if we're building more plants, facilities to process oil. Here's a criticism from the left that I've had issue with, is that 9,000 oil leases are out there and unused. And Joe Biden's like, what are you guys doing? Use the oil. I want to respond to this. I just brought it up and I'm responding to it, and then you can respond to my response.
I'm excited for this, yeah.
Okay. Apparently about half of them are not ready for drilling, and the regulatory requirements, as Matt brought up earlier, can take up to a decade.
Mm-hmm.
Just because they're ready for drilling and available does not mean they're going to find oil there. They have land. They might find a good oil pit. They might not.
Mm-hmm.
Similarly, actually, this is differently. There are labor shortages. It's COVID. There's equipment shortages. Things need to go from all over the world.
Also, the labor to operate an oil rig, let's be clear, is pretty highly skilled. If you're doing it at scale.
Sure.
Just putting that out there.
Yeah, you need to train people. Employment numbers are one of the bright spots of the Biden economy. Unemployment is very low. Matt, I don't know if you're planning on dropping out to work on an oil rig. I am not. So finding labor and equipment shortages is difficult. And one of the biggest difficulties comes from the left or the climate activists politically, is that investment has dried up. ESG investments pushing against oil. Drilling requires sustained investments, like we said, 10 years to get permitting, 6